What's up? My name is Scrim. I've been playing 7 million hands of poker online. I played last few years a little bit of live too. I've coached about 500 people from around the world in about 2,000 hours. I've coached CFPs and I built sims for companies. And this is how I've procrastinated through studying for many, many years. I'm just kidding. But this is an anti-procrastination coaching. So what I want you to do after this coaching is actually open a sim and look at it. And I'm hoping that this coaching will change, if not, your studying regimen, mostly just the way you study and the way you approach studying, and will just generally simplify your life when looking at a sim. And this is what I wanted for my first coaching for GTO Wizard. So let's get into it. What is the plan for this coaching? How to finally start studying efficiently and set up an achievable plan for yourself. I'm really, really hoping that until the end of this 1 hour that you guys can get a really, really good plan of what you should and should not do, hopefully, regarding Sims, regarding how to study, regarding how to build your whole strategy, because this is a let's build the whole strategy system. And we're going to go through two different styles. Breadth generally means simplifying what you're studying and looking at it like surface level, and then going deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And depth is looking at a very, very like extremely specific spot and going super, super overboard, and then going from that super specific spot, like from that pixel on the screen. If that pixel has the color red, let's say, then you look exactly around it to see if those colors are also red, also red, also red, right? So we start with a really, really small spot and then try to expand from it. How to develop heuristics from your level of complexity. So when we're starting out like at the top, right, from the surface of the water, and we go deeper and deeper, how to develop heuristics from a very simple approach and then like expand those heuristics and see how well they expand if we go deeper, if we go more specific, and a concrete hands-on example on how I personally go and study a spot. And hopefully we'll have time for time sinks and behaviors that you should really avoid. So when selecting a complexity level for yourself, this is one of the most important spots, I think, of this coaching. So please pay attention. Studying poker is very complex. If you're looking at 1,755 flops for every spot that are approximately 45, if you don't include three-way, if you don't include everything, yeah, it's gonna be extremely overwhelming, especially if you're like starting out. So I'm going to give you a plan to go for action, right? So go into it instead of looking at it, looking at this great wall of China of poker spots and poker flops, and then another 50 turns, 50 rivers, and thinking, I can't do this, So so Tombos has built a priority spot Excel sheet, right? So I actually have it right here. We can look at it. It's called Spot Importance V3. And the way this works is you have all the spots in Nolman Hold'em, and then you have their frequency, you have their starting pot size, you have their average pot size at Showdown, right? So I think this is slightly more important. This was added later, if I remember. EV percentage and practice priority. So if the way you read this is if this is 100%, then this will be priority 90%. This will be 85 for your GTO Wizard score of 70%. What I wanted to say and add to this chart was when studying, so like obviously you're going to study SRP, single race spots, but everybody's going to study single race spots, button versus big blind, small blind versus big blind. And this is also really, really hard, by the way. So the easier spots are like UTG versus big blind and button versus big blind. And everybody's going to study that because they're also the easier spots and they're kind of like pillars of poker in general. But what you could do, and I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit, is also think about what are your opponents going to study? Like, what are they interested in? Everybody's going to study SRP, especially everybody who has this chart is going to study SRP because you see how important they are. And then they're going to study button versus small blind, button versus big blind, 3-bet pots, which is great. But as Owen Masur or Prodigy has put it recently, who the heck studies 4-bet pots, right? who has time for 4-bit pots, which is great because you will not have to put in 80 hours that you have to put in, for example, in an SRP spot to get up to par with people who play no mid 500, for example. In small blind versus big blind 4-bit pots, or something like button versus small blind 4-bit pots, you will have to put in probably about 20 hours and be way better. It's like your edge on your opponents will be actually a lot bigger. So it will be huge because you'll only have to put in about 20 hours to have a ridiculous edge over your opponents who have actually never studied this particular spot or in general 4-bet pots. So, and you don't even need to study them like button versus small blind and cutoff versus small blind. No, these are very similar. Even hijack versus small blind, UTG versus small blind are also very similar. So, but yeah, you don't need to study all the SRPs. Early position equals hijack, mostly. Button equals cutoff. And in 3-bet pots, you don't need to study like all the 3-bet spots. You can study big blind versus button. You can study small blind versus button, right? Because you have a wide formation, 3-betting versus a range versus mostly a bluff catcher range. And you have a polar formation, 3-betting versus a bluff catcher range. And small blind versus early and big blind versus early, because the early position will just have a tighter, more narrower range. And that's kind of mostly it. So in this pot, I would like to show you also one thing. It's like it's it's that close that if you look at a spot in your solution library, which is, kind of SRP hijack, and you look at big blind's range, right? Big blind's range will have these folds and these folds, right? Which is versus hijack. If we look at UTG, it's like big blind facing UTG, you can also see that this is kind of similar. If you look at it, there are some offsuit aces, like which is like what's the border of the range? You always look at the border of the range. And you have the offsuit aces, you have the offsuit connectors that are mixing, and you have like 10-5 suited, some Jack 3 suited that is mixing. Let's look at cutoff, right? So if cutoff opens and big blind calls, what does it look like? 10-5 offsuit, Jack 3 suited, offsuit aces, and offsuit connectors, right? Let's look at button. How does big blind's range look like? Well, 10-5 suited, right? There's a little bit of over defend here, like Jack 3, Jack deuce, but it mostly just looks the same. There is a bit of a difference in the top region, whereas versus hijack, the top is going to be slightly stronger, right? Because there's these hands don't actually 3-bet that much. But and versus the button, we're going to get a wider 3-betting range. But mostly the calling range will look sort of the same. So when studying SRPs, you mostly only need to study one, maximum two, not a problem. Why is big blind range also, you might ask, why is big blind range kind of similar-ish or not? When you have an opening range of 2 from ETG, so it's a stronger range, you have an opening range of an opening size of 2.3 from the cutoff, and you have the big blind range that looks something like this. It looks the same because a wider range is opening a higher size, and then a wider range is opening a higher size. So mostly big blind's range will have to defend more versus the wider range, but because the sizing goes up, they have to actually defend less. So it gets to around the same defense range as per call versus button, cutoff, and UTG, hijack being just slightly trailing in a sense. Okay, so getting back to our presentation, study method number 1, and I think this is very, very important, is assigning desired complexity. Instead of going for like all your flops, go to as small of a subset as you wish. This is the number 1 thing that I want to super, super emphasize on, is get the smallest subset, and it's great. And I will prove to you right now that it is great. If we look at, and this is the spot that we're going to look at today, it's hijack versus big blind call. And we're going to look at flop reports for this. So we're going to look at the total reports, right? And then from here, the way you select the subset is you go to filters and you select 25 right here, where it says subset. There's a filters button, you select 25. And it will give you directly the 25 flops that you have to study. These are all of them, and they mostly mimic a sort of flop that you might encounter in game, right? If we look at global frequencies, you'll see that these at the top are for all the flops, and these slightly below, it says 1.7% of flops, which you will study, and you will see that the frequencies for check, bet 33, bet 50, bet 76, so all the bet size that you can apply in the sim are mostly the same, are very, very, very close to each other. So overbetting, 8% general frequency, 7.8 on the 25 subset. Bet 76, so bet three quarters, 11.4, 10.9. That's really, really close. Even though this is a 1.7% flop subset. B half pot, 17.8, 18.9. 31.4, 28.5. It's slightly more different here. I'm checking, they're mostly the same. So if you can learn in a few of these spots, so you don't need to learn all the spots, all the SRPs. You need to learn UTG versus big blind SRP, button versus big blind SRP, one 3-bet in position. So hijack raise, cut off 3-bet, hijack call. You're facing, so you're doing a really strong 3-bet range versus bluff catcher range. If you can learn it on all of these boards, how the bet sizes work, like frequencies, we're going to see in a second, then that's all you need to do to actually understand Hold'em at a very, very base level. And if you can do that, then you can figure out even exploits at like in that spot, pretty much. So these are the boards that we want to look at. And I think this is great, honestly. So it simplifies life immensely. Okay. So let's look at 25 flop subsets. You will also restrict your number of bet sizes on flops and turns and even rivers. So on flops, you will do a single size sim. And this is where also GTO Wizard AI comes in. But you will use one singular bet size, either 25 or 75. That's all that we're starting with. We want to cover a large island of flops that would like a small size and a large size on the flop. On the turn, again, a single size, and we will capture most of the EV like this. Two bet sizes that are different from each other. Basically, we're still using a single size on the turn, 50 or 100, and we can also add here 150 that I thought of later, but you will see how this works. And the river will be freestyle, basically mostly against most human opponents. It's kind of okay to bet what your hand is worth, or you just leave it on automatic like it's in the GTO Wizard AI. And once you develop a game plan for this kind of strategy, you either improve your flop subset from 25 to 49, or you improve your game mechanic complexity. So you improve the number of bet sizes that you use. You will still use one flop size, one bet size on the flop, but you add from 25 to 75. You can add 50, you can add 100, you can add 125, or even 150. So 40% works on a lot of flops and so on and so forth. So if we're looking at study method 1, we will look into GTO Wizard a little bit. Also, one thing that I wanted to show you guys is, first of all, yes, this flop subset really works because the bet sizes and frequencies are really, really close to like the general frequencies. So that's great. But also why the flop subset works, it's because it's a subset of as least amount of flops as possible that is calculated to be as farther apart from each other. So most of the flops that you encounter in the game of Hold'em, you'll see that they are mostly like identifiable in one of these flops. So for example, you have high pair, high card, Broadway, that high pair that's not an ace and with an ace queen nine, so ace Broadway high, ace low low, ace. This is the ace high monotone board. We'll see that there are only two monotone boards, the other one being the 960. So one is a ace high monotone and the other one is whatever monotone, because mostly they play the same. The low ones and the ace high is very, very different for a reason that we'll see in a second. Ace low low and so on and so forth. You will have mostly assorted by high card, suitedness, and you'll have them in the frequency that they actually come up. So there's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 ace high boards, 4 king high, 3 queen high. Well, actually 4 jack high, but I guess this is more like Broadway sort of thing, and then less of like the lower high card boards. So that's kind of how this works, this flop subset. And I've prepared a coaching SRP start your journey that I will also share in Discord. So this is a tree for hijack versus big blind. You always want to use pre-fill here. So I made some mistakes along the way while trying to use GTO Wizard and importing ranges from here and there. Just copy paste it. You just want to use this prefill. I recommend the 500 ranges with GTO sizes, and 100 big blinds. Big blind versus hijack SRP. And on the flop, you click on dynamic, one bet size, one raise. 25, 75. That's all you need for big blind. I just leave this on force check, but always add all in. And that's mostly how I started studying this. That's all I needed to do. On the turn, again, you leave the number of bets and number of raises for like your opponent, and then you put in 50 and 100. You can also put in 150, no problem here, because later on you will not have to learn this over and over. So turn complexity, 3 sizes, that's also okay, but really make sure that your number of bets is 1, and you will kind of always stay in it that way, because it will capture most of the EV that you can gain even in a multiple bet sizes that is kind of not really executable by a human. Raise sizes now you will only do on the flop 75. That's it. Okay, you can do 50 if you want, you can do whatever. Later on, you will do 50 and 100. So later on, you will expand this. I did another coaching SRP advanced, where on the flop you have, for example, 4 sizes, and the raise sizes will be 50 and 100. So later on, you get to complicate your strategy. But when starting out, when you're starting your journey into learning, when you're starting to not procrastinate anymore, like I did, and I'm hoping that most of you haven't, but I'm pretty sure that some of you have, you will only use 25 and 75 on flops. That's it. And you will capture most flops this way. Later, you will learn other nuances of flops. You will have larger samples of flops that you will work with, and you will have larger pools of bet sizes. But the pool of bet size that we're going to use is just this 25, 75. That's it. Okay. Dynamic, specify sizes to compare. You just use these two, and that's how you learn. Turn 50, 100. You can add 150 if you want to. Sorry, I just typed in 125. And then just one raise size, just one re-raise size. That's it. You want to learn the strategy of Hold'em this way, because because it will be less intimidating, and later on you will be able to expand this and see nuances in the strategy. But if you don't start somewhere, and if you don't start with a really small, like a really, really small grain of sand, and start seeing like how it looks like and how it works, and you will not take the whole beach at once, if that makes sense, right? So this is by far not a grain of sand. This is probably half the beach already. If you just learn 2 flop sizes and 3 turn sizes, and that's mostly it, and you understand like how flops and turns work and why they want to do that. So we'll get into an example. This will be very, very clear in a second. So once you develop the game plan for this kind of strategy, you improve either flop subset, you go from 25 to the 49 one, which is not actually really necessary, but it's necessary to improve your game mechanics complexity. So from sizes that are 25 and 75 on the flop, I would go 25, 50, 75, and 125, leaving out pot because it's kind of. And on the turn, 50, 100, and by the way, flop raise sizes, yeah, 50 and 100. And on the turn, you can do 50, like half pot, and 150% over bet. So this is study method number 1, and we're going to look at also an example why flop subsets work. We talked about it mostly, and they represent the full 1,755 flop game tree really, really well. And they will make your life a lot easier when, studying a hand, because you'll see a flop and you'll see, okay, what kind of flop in the subset is this closest to? And that's the strategy that you apply to it. Okay. So this is the way that we're studying in a very simplified format, right? And we're going to actually look at a practical example in the subset and with our specified sizes. So let's do that. We're going to look at this big blind versus hijack, right? Turn sizes, we're going to leave 50, 100, and 150. And then on the flop, we're going to leave 25 and 75. And we're going to choose one board that I have pre-chosen from the 25 subset, which is the ace high monotone. And I'm going to show you a little bit about how I look into spots this way, right? Clear check. I generally remove the all-in for extra precision, mostly. And we're going to look at this hijack. And first of all, what can we notice? We're noticing that there's a B25 or B24, whatever, for about 57% of the pot. I say, in general, to execute the strategy like this. you can go and say, okay, we're going to go to the ranges tab. And here you're going to learn something really, really important. Okay. Our EV is 259 as the hijack, which means this is the share of the pot. And on the long run, this is what we earn. You can choose to remove checking and just leave bet range. And you can do something like lose 4 blinds per 100, but execute a perfect strategy. This is valid in some spots. So 4 blinds per 100 is actually quite a lot. This is valid in some spots where you're looking at a board something like ace 8-4 offsuit, and then you're removing, so the EV is 276, and you're removing the bet size, right? So from 67.5, we have 2.75, which is not really an EV deviation that should be considered significant, right? Especially because you're executing your strategy perfect. But on something like, and I chose it specifically here, a6-5, if you deviate to bet range, you will do poorly. You'll lose 4 blinds per 100, which you really don't want to do that. The way you do this, the way you execute the strategy, you get better at it in time. If you use, and why I chose a 25% bet size and 75% bet size. First of all, they represent the, I think, EV scape pretty well. Second of all, you will see that if you look at summary, right? So you look at your strategy and you look at this tab that's called summary, you will see that you can sort by strategy. And first of all, you can learn on the 25 boards which hands are we almost pure checking, and which hands are we almost pure betting by sorting by strategy. So we will always bet something like king, queen of hearts. We will mostly, you can also look into filters. We'll mostly bet flushes and sets, right? But it's very, very important. I think the hardest part is, or the easiest knowledge that you can acquire, is looking at which hands we are actually almost pure checking. You can find reasons why. For example, if you bet kings no heart on this board, it's a nightmare if you get raised. You always have to think about it because your opponent has the option to raise 25%. And it's just a nightmare for like pocket kings. You mostly just want to take this hand to showdown. A hand that has a lot of equity, like 6-5, right? But this is a board that shifts a lot of nuts on the turn and river. A hand like ace deuce of spades, right? It's a nightmare to get check raised because again, it's a board that changes a lot of nuts, right? But what I wanted to specify and what I really, really wanted you guys to understand is that when you have a small bet size, you always know specifically almost precisely the frequency because you can get that from reports, you can get that from your own study, and the hands won't vary that much, right? So if you know the bet size and frequency, approximate frequency, okay, so not exact, you will see that most of the hands, this is like a 57, right? You'll see that most of the hands, so we're like almost at the top here, and this would be about, yeah, this would be about 40% betting, right? And now we go close to the bottom, right? And this would be about 77% betting. Most of the hands are not going to fluctuate that much, right? So when looking at B25, looking at a bet size, and you know the frequency very approximately because you've studied the 25 flop subset. And that's it, not all of them, right? The frequency won't deviate that much if the bet size is small. Okay, so if the bet size is B25, most of them are going to be very close to the actual global frequency. There's going to be some hands that really, really like to check, and you can kind of remember those, right? It's like bottom two pair, top pair no kicker, some hands that don't really benefit from betting, like pocket jacks. Even pocket jacks, like you see, like it has some frequency of betting. And then suddenly, like we get to something like ace 10 with the 10 hearts, or something like king queen, and we're already betting almost 30%, right? We go to pocket eights with the heart, we're betting 45. And look at like the portion of range that is actually betting very close to frequency, right? So I want you guys to remember, if you have a small bet size, right, that the frequency will not fluctuate that much. But if you have a large bet size, that's where you're more polar and the frequency will fluctuate a lot more, right? So then if you have a bigger bet size, you'll really, really want to look at hands that like pure check, there's going to be more of them, and hands that pure bet, because there's going to be like a larger sort of contingency of also hands that pure bet. But with bet 25 or even B40, if you know the overall frequency, then you'll generally be fine with most of your strategy. You can kind of execute this better than just bet range or check range, right? Okay, so if we go past this and That's kind of how I see the flop strategy, and that's kind of how you learn this flop strategy. Then, when studying, this is what you look for. So we're gonna look into a spot. So today you start looking into a spot. Let's say SRP, hijack versus big blind. Global overview, frequencies, strategy, simplifications, and exploits. We're gonna go through each one of them, right? So when you global overview of spot, you want to use the reports to find out what the general idea is. So you can look at the flop reports in the pre-solved libraries section. Also, you can also build your custom reports now that that feature is available. Figure out overall frequencies and bet size preferences, right? And as a bonus, you sort by each bet size and you figure out which boards highly prefer each. And also you sort by checking. Remember to always sort by checking because you can kind of figure out which boards are really good and which boards are really bad for your range in general. Those that are your mostly almost pure checking, then you can kind of figure out that they're really bad for your range. And once you're familiarized with the overall sense of the strategy and both of the ranges at play, you can filter for the 25 flop subset and look at each board's strategy. So if we're looking into hijack versus big blind, I actually have a custom report ready for this one. This is hijack versus big blind, SRP, and we're looking at the overall spot frequencies, the overall spot boards, and we're looking at also the 25 subset. But let's say that we'd like to look into something like monotone boards, right? So if we look at monotone boards, and you can filter here actually by height card, right? So that's what we're looking earlier into, a 6-5, 3 hearts. You can filter it by height card, and you can look in a chart view, which is slightly funner. So the sizes that are used, mostly like bet 25, B50 is slight rarity. It does appear in some spots, but we can see an outlier here. So if we look into all of these like ace to 4 high card, we see a slight outlier here, the ace. And you can immediately kind of think, so why would hijack be super trailing compared to the other cards on an ace? And then you can find the answer mostly in the pre-flop ranges, because if you look into the if you look into the pre-flop range of big blind versus hijack, right? Look at the hijack pre-flop range. If you remove the ace from the suited side, then there's not that many flushes. But if you look at the big blind's range, there will be a lot of flushes if you remove the ace, right? So that's where we have a slight disadvantage in nuts. So if we're gonna follow this theory and look at a board, right? If we're gonna kind of follow this theory and look at our board of a6-5, which I kind of also saved, but I'm just gonna go through this one more time, show you guys how you can do it, right? Looking at this bet size, right, and the counter strategy, then you need to start looking into some turns, I guess. But if we're looking at global overview, that's kind of how you do it. You do it with the reports. Yeah, so you look at the global frequencies for the subset, and they're close to the general, and then you start, looking into the subset. So frequencies, you go to GTO Wizard AI, you build your tree with your preferred sizing and complexity, like we kind of already did. You grab each flop from the subset, and you kind of note what the solver chooses as the highest EV bet size and what frequency it uses. So we did this in reports already. So you can do this individually without doing the report. But if we're going to filter out the 25 subset in reports, right, and we're going to look at the table and buy flops, you can see each board and which bet size it chooses and, how often it likes to bet and or check. You can clearly tell that on paired boards, it likes a small bet size, for example, or you can tell that, yeah, so king, king 10, king 10, 10, so you can understand on which boards it likes a small bet size, medium or large, and so on and so forth. And then you go into each board's specifics, let's say. Anyways, so you try to look at you grab each flop from the subset and note what the solver chooses as the highest EV bet size and what kind of frequency it uses. You try to look at the other side too, like what are their counters, what is my opponent supposed to be doing, and is that really easy to execute for a human, right? You go from each flop to a type of turn. You complete, like you can use complete brick, full draw completer, partial draw completer, overcard, which is the ace, another overcard, and drawbringer. and you kind of see how this affects bet sizes, ranges, and frequencies. And I prepared a very, very fun example for this coaching, which is again big blind versus hijack. And we're gonna use the start journey sim, and it's the A65 mono again. We're gonna go bet, right? So we're gonna use the 57% frequency B25, gonna get called, and we're going to put in a draw completer on the turn. We're going to put in the 10 of hearts, and this is going to be really, really fun because a lot of people don't actually expect how this spot like really works. My bad, I forgot to add the overbet on the turn because I thought that two bet sizes would suffice, but I really want to illustrate the fact that in this particular spot with this monotone board, you're going to have a very clear turnover bet, which a lot of people don't actually do this. So I see a lot of people using B75 on this turn or something like B50 because in general, when equities really close in, so when a draw completes, like for example, you have something like ace queen 3 with a flush on the flop and you get like a 10 that completes the flush on the turn. There, you're generally supposed to be using a small size because the equities really close in. A lot of draws get there. And people think that this is the same because this is a turn that completes a draw. It really completes any single hard drawing hand. So why are we overbetting in this spot? Well, you will get a lot of information from the ranges tab. When you go into the ranges tab, you really, really want to look into this EQ buckets advanced. If you look into this EQ buckets, so you click, you don't use simple because simple does not give the whole picture. If you use advanced and you look at it a little bit, you will see that us as hijack, we will have a huge, huge, huge top range advantage, right? And they will have a 70 to 80% equity sort of advantage in this area. So what we're trying to do with our bet size in general, when we're overbetting, is we have nut advantage and they have a lot of hands in these buckets, right? So we're trying to sort of level the equity with this portion of our range because you will see that really don't have equity advantage, but we're in position and we have hands that we can bet. So we don't have equity advantage. Why are we overbetting? Well, exactly that, because we're super polar. Our top range kind of gets there, right? And then their sort of middling range is kind of just hanging around there, right? So what are we thing number one that you should be looking at is what are we accomplishing with this overbet? The way you do this is you look at the strategy tab and you look at his reaction and you look in summary and you sort by strategy and you go towards when the hands start mixing and you look exactly at the hands right here that are mixing versus our bet size, right? So these are slightly kind of mixing, but these are the hands that you make indifferent. So what hands are we making indifferent on this board? A6, 5, 10, 4 hearts. Sorry, I don't know why it went back down there. Yeah, apparently if we hover over hands, so I'll just leave it here. What are the hands that we are making it different? 9 of hearts, jack of hearts, 7 of hearts, 8 of hearts. So all these hands, pocket eights, two pair, ace 5, right? 10 plus heart, so set blocker plus heart. We're making different all these hands with our overbet size. So if we're doing that, then we have another question that we might like to add or to ask. How is our advantage so large? Well, this tracks back to the flop when we bet with our 57%, and we got raised by our opponent. What is our opponent really raising us with? Well, you can see this in the filters tab that he's raising flushes, sets a lot more often than flushes, which is fun. But also in draws, he's raising a lot of combo draws. He's raising a lot of flush draw nuts. So half of his king X go into the raise portion, right? So if half of his king X go into the raise portion, then on this turn, when the flush for the single card hands completes, that's why in the ranges tab, we have so much nut advantage here over his jack of hearts, 8 of hearts, 9 of hearts, right? So we want to punish those hands with our nut advantage. And that's exactly what we're doing with the silver bet. Now, there is a really, really fun part about this is if we look at a brick river and big line checks again, because we're polarized and he just has a bluff catching range, then if we're gonna overbet again, because this is the preferred size, it just wants to overbet, right? We just have 50% overbet, kind of almost 50% check. This is not really a thing. If we overbet here and big blind just has a bluff catching range, right? I want you to really look at this range and try to figure out like what's going on here. Like what's happening? Yeah, he's gonna fold mostly MDF. He's gonna call, and he has an all-in range for about half pot. But if you look at its all-in range, the funniest part is there's no bluffs here. I was looking at the spot, and then I realized like why, but this is a very fun spot, and I will latch onto this. I will latch onto this really specific spot and figure out like, okay, why are there no bluffs? Sure, if we're overbetting, then he just has a bluff catching range from the turn, right? We go back, he just has a bluff catching range. All the draws have completed. There's 4 hearts down there. There's no straight draws that he could bluff in the spot that he can call the turn with. So when he jams, it's just a flush. It's just nut flush, right? And when he jams, it's a game of either I have the king or I don't have the king. It's like if I have the king, you don't have the king. If you have the king, I don't have the king, right? So it's mostly just B150 for hijack, and raise all in will just not have bluffs like at all. Like if you look at the raise, it will just have the king of hearts. That's it. All the raises, all the king of hearts raise, and there's absolutely nothing else that is a bluff. I thought this was a fun spot and I wanted to show you. Anyways, so then you take different turns and then you look at how the range morphology works. And the way you can also kind of get a grasp of how this works is you go into the solution library in this exact spot. You look at flop reports, you input the flop, you take this almost exact line, B33 is pretty close to B25, and you look at the turn reports. And then you can see, I recommend usually this view, mostly report turns, but you can also remember to use all the other functions. Also sort by suits. I think this will be slightly more relevant. You can see that on hearts, we're mostly just overbet or checking. So this is a huge heuristic that you can apply. And then the next question that you should be curious about in this spot is, can we overbet on a heart in the same spot if the top card on the flop would be a king, would be a queen, would be a jack? Does this spot work like this? Monotone board, flush, 4 flush turn. Do we only overbet or check in all the spots possible? And that's the next question that you should be answering to yourself, right? So and then you kind of have this huge heuristic that encompasses most of the spots that are like monotone SRP, first big line. And you now understand that on a turn, you're supposed to be overbetting, right? So you have a huge nut advantage and you're supposed to be overbetting on a 4 flush card turn. So if you're looking into the sim, that's kind of how I go into the whole situation. I'd go another turn and look at turn reports and then look at individual turns and which bet sizes the AI solver chooses and so on and so forth. So, right after this, so after you understand like frequencies and you try different turns, you look at like the overall strategy. You look at what each bet size is trying to achieve by frequency and sizing. So we look into the strategy mini tab on the right, and you see which hands you're trying to nullify their EV, right? So you scroll down until you start seeing like the mixing hands, and those are the hands that your bet size is targeting. Those are the hands that your strategy is trying to steal EV from, deny their equity or kind of nullify their EV. You do this for flops, turns, and rivers, and try more than remembering to get a grasp, right? So we look at that turn and we understood like what's going on. Why do we have this very large equity and nut advantage? Why are we trying to overbet this hard turn where it really doesn't make a lot of sense? But then you kind of figure out the spot and then you realize, oh, this is why, right? So stay on that spot. And then you try to understand how large and how much you can actually expand it. Okay. Simplifications, time to no lock and adjust, right? We're going to do a practical example. So if your betting frequency is generally over 80%, you can kind of bet range. If it's under 20%, you can kind of also check range for ease of execution and not losing a lot of BB per 100. In EV, not versus a human opponent, right? Try to see what your opponent can do against it. You can node lock different steps and check like the EV comparison in the ranges tab. And while at the same time, you look at his counterplay and try to see if a human opponent would ever do that. unless you're playing like normally 2K or something and you play very savvy opponents that might think, oh, he bet 25, it's a range bet, so my counter is to raise bottom pair a lot and raise middle pair a lot, right? So you do this for flops and turns, and like you really try to simplify your execution as much as possible. Okay. So here on this in this particular spot, right? On the flush turn, you can't really, so on the flop, you kind of can, but I wouldn't recommend it, right? But on this turn, if we're looking at the filters, if we're looking at like the formations, you're mostly like, I think it's pretty clear that we're betting, we're pure betting top set, we're pure betting mid set, right? Sixes and fives, almost pure checking. So the heuristic here that you can remember is you bet top set, you bet top two sets, you check back bottom two sets. I think that's really easy, right? What are the bluffs here? And I think that you can filter out the trash hands and you can look at, okay, it's like this is pretty clear also because it's an overbet, so you will get generally very clear inputs when you're overbetting. It's mostly like king highs if you look at it, and it's mostly like the ones that are, well, let me actually filter out. So trash hands, the ones that are betting. There we go. It's mostly like if you look at it, it's suited kings. That's kind of it, and some suited queens. This is not like really super complicated to remember that I'm betting these low suited kings and low suited queens as bluffs. And that's kind of it. You can just do these pure and do the others just not. And you'll generally be okay with it, right? Because all the draw is kind of got there. There's not much to, you know, these are already like super bricks. You need zero equity bluffs in the spot, right? Because the draw kind of got there. So yeah, these are kind of like the bluffs that you're going to be using on flush turns, right? If you're gonna like kind of also node lock versus your opponent, so we're gonna look at a node lock example where if we're gonna bet range, so one thing that you want to really look at, and please pay attention to this because this is really important. Do not look at the percentage of pot. I made this mistake, and the pot size will kind of change based on the bet size that you use. So when looking, and the frequency, because the rake might increase if your bet size increases and your frequency increases. I don't use this anymore. I just use the numerical value. So I really recommend this. Okay, if you're going to be applying the strategy and you're going to look into, maybe we should bet range, right? You look into your general overall EV, and then you just remove the size. You don't need to use the node locking feature, which there is a new one implemented. I hope I do well with it. I'm not exactly sure yet. From 259, we dropped 4 BB per 100, right? But is our opponent really going to raise 23%? We're going to look at a6-5. We're going to look at the hands that he's raising. Clearly, he's going to raise flushes and sets pure. I think a human would probably do that. But he might think that we're betting range, but the counter is actually pretty hard to execute. If you look at it, you have to raise 4 deuce, no draw. You have to raise 4-3. 4-3 is more normal because it's open ender. This is a 4 high gut shot. Have to raise a lot of bottom pair and second pair, which is probably not going to happen in reality. People just either click call or actually click fold with those hands on mono boards. Jack 9 with the Jack of Hearts, mostly going to click call. 2 pair automotive boards, mostly going to click call. Not really going to raise very often. Also, something like ace 9 and ace 8 with a heart, people just mostly going to click call. You're not going to get aggressed 23% of the times, right? So then you will go to the no lock screen, which this is the new one. I don't yet know because this just got put in right before. I don't yet know how it works, but I can kind of get a little bit of intuition here that the raise percentage, especially on this board, will kind of go to half. I will say that this is generous because this still uses 6-4 suited. This still uses some bottom pairs. People just generally don't do that unless they're like rainbow boards and they know that they should check raise bottom pair, bottom kicker, and they sometimes do that. But most people in real games under check raise, they don't know that you're bet ranging. They haven't studied the spot. They don't know that you shouldn't bet range and so on and so forth. That stuff starts at about 500 and 1,000. So if you apply this node lock, and let's look at how much do we lose. You always look at the root node. How much are we actually losing in general? Now it's 257. So we dropped down from 259 to 255. But if our opponent can't counter effectively, it's only a 2 blinds per 100 difference. Does the strategy stay the same on the turn? I think since our opponent is also raising a larger size, it'll mostly stay the same on the turn. I might be wrong on this one, but I still think that we're at largely kind of overbetting. Yeah. We're overbetting slightly tighter, but mostly the strategy is kind of the same. You just overbet nuts and you bluff with your low king highs. And that's kind of it. So if you want to range bet on this board, you can range bet. That's absolutely fine. If you don't want to range bet, I really, really recommend complexifying. Is that a word? Complexifying your strategy and actually applying checks. Then it will be better in EV and it will be better for you. And you do that in the way that we discussed earlier with looking at the summary, looking at hands that would really like to pure check, like, kings no heart, and so on and so forth. You mostly pure check those. And the other hands are mostly like a very, very close mix. And depending on if you really want to bet them or not, you heighten the frequency a little bit or you lower it and you'll be fine. So mostly that's kind of how you do this. Okay, sweet. So exploits. FAFO time. This is the fun step. You try to figure out counters to your strategy. You try to figure out and simplify your strategy the most, and you complicate their response. So as simple as you can for your strategy, as complicated of a response for their strategy. Regarding the new node locking, if you set it to e.g. raise 10% of the time, it will find the least exploitable way to do that. Old version of node locking, then find the least exploitable way to do that. I'm thankful that I found the UI like place that you do that, because the UI just looked different and I panicked, but it was okay. Yeah. So the previous step that we talked about is also part of exploit. Simplifying your strategy will allow you to execute better and obligates your opponent to deviate, right? So figure out where your opponent is likely to make deviations from the strategy. Like we talked, like, okay, people are not going to raise bottom pair in general on monotone boards. They're mostly going to click call or fold because in general, they know that if another bet is coming, and you probably won't get that to showdown. And if another bet is coming, they probably won't ever call that. Right? They're just perceived as being really, really weak holdings, and people generally don't think about raising them. So you don't lock the perceived deviations and see directly how you exploit. You look at different turns that are really good for you and look at perceived ranges and overbluffing, right? And checking can also be an exploit. There is a I think, very good coaching by Yolan Cohen in the cash game section, where he deviates small blind versus big blind, a spot where you can also gain a lot of edge by studying it for at least something like 20 hours, because your opponents will have studied it for something like maybe 5, and you can try to figure out how. So normally that spot is played with a small c bet, like the pot size is something like 6, you bet 1 on a lot of boards. And what he said is that on boards where you're not forced to check or forced, like mostly range bet boards, he likes to just go range check, because the big blind is not really supposed to be stabbing. You're going to have, in theory, you see a turn very, very often, but the big blind just overstabs that spot massively, because also in MDA lands, in that spot, you get a lot of folds. So then he studied the counter. So he studied how to pure check that spot, and then he studied what the counter is to big blind overstabbing, and he applies it very successfully in real games, and that's kind of how you do it, right? And that's how checking can also be an exploit. The simplest explanation of this I can offer is try to go one direction and see what your opponent's counter is, and then try to go the other and see what your opponent's kind of counter is, and whichever the hardest, you know, and if the decision kind of maintains your AV, that's where you want to go. So spot importance. You want to balance spot importance. We talked about this a little bit earlier with the amount your opponents study, right? So everybody's going to study button versus big blind SRP. Everybody's going to study 3-bet button versus cutoff, right? But the spots that are the hardest are usually the understudied. And big blind versus small blind is a pretty frequent spot that nobody puts a lot of effort into. If you put a lot of effort into that, especially SRP, you will absolutely crush. Your win rate will go sky high because the ranges are the widest. People overfold versus bet. People overfold versus bet turn. People have no idea that on some flops you're supposed to 2.5x pot, and you will see like if they have no idea, they won't know how to adjust. They will just either mostly just overfold that spot. So you can find the spots in the Tambo spot importance V3 document that are of super importance, but like understudied, right? So you can look at them. Nobody studies 4-bet pots. Nobody studies 3-bet pots in general, like big blind versus pot, because a lot of people just have trouble even executing the big blind 3-bet at a relevant percentage. Their big blind 3-bet becomes non-polarized. It becomes wide instead of polarized, or either way, they under bluff massively in that spot. Great spots, like start messing with opening 2.2 BBs. Start messing with opening 2.5 BBs from the small blind. Try to realize how that changes, how that should change the big blind's defense range. You have some sims for that. If you select GTO Wizard preflop only, you have like some tests for that, for opening different sizes and seeing how big blind reacts. For example, one of my favorite preflop exploits is opening 2 BB from the button, for example, because people are really expect you to open 2.5x, and then they start under defending the big blind. They just defend versus like 2.5x, or they think about what hands they're supposed to be calling extra, but they never 3-bet those. And it just becomes really fun. And the blinds don't understand that they're supposed to be under 3-betting and calling more, and they just have a hard time adjusting versus like button 2 BBs. And you just generate win rate for that. Or even you can find limp strategies that are mixed with raises. Small blind being one of them, but if you limp an early position here and there, it's not the end of the world and will put people so much off track. And if you study the spot a little bit and they studied 0 of it, you will have a huge edge in exploits. So everybody's kind of in the, let's say, in the 1000, only 1000 GG pool, everybody's kind of trying to get as close to GTO as possible. So if you kind of start deviating a little bit from the root of it, people have some sort of idea, but if you studied that spot that you've also created, then you have like a massive edge, huge edge, right? Wacko said, for example, like a few years ago where he was playing high stakes, that these guys started limping early and middle. Nobody knew how to play versus them. And then it took them a while, and always takes them a while to get into a solver, really figure out how the spot works, and stop being exploited by those guys. And I think that's like an awesome example of what you can start doing. Right? Get used to the idea of losing EV in a solver to gain dollar EV, real EV from your opponents. Okay. So how to expand complexity after you've studied the 25 flop subset, and you've studied, like, which bet size wants, sorry, which board wants which bet size in which spot. Flop single size start out with like 4 bet sizes afterwards, but really apart from each other: 25, 50, 75, and 125. Turns, you go single size 3 bet sizes: 50, 100, and 150. And then river, you still kind of freestyle it. You kind of bet how much your hand is worth, and or how much if you think your opponent will call. Then you thin value bet if you think he's like overfolding. Then you stop value betting the bottom kind of quadrant of the sim that you want to study, and you like value bet less, and you bluff. Well, you also have to bluff less. But anyways, river, you just leave on automatic and it's fine. Once you're comfortable with these many sizes and can really differentiate flops and strategies, you can go for the next subset of flops. But honestly, that's kind of also nuancing, which kind of gets us into the parallel of the mathematician Pierre de Fermat. Well, genius, playboy, billionaire, philanthropist for Iron Man fans of the 17th century. Well, almost. Lawyer by day and later counselor, math Batman by night. Why am I saying math Batman? Because he casually scribbles world-shaking theorems in book margins, right? So he revolutionized modern number theory, differential calculus, even trigonometry, some geometry stuff. He did a lot for math, and this was just his hobby, right? So I thought this was amazing, and he leaves an insane theorem you know, try to try to find like the reason why. But pocket sevens is now betting, more sixes is now betting, fives is now betting, right? That's being braver. That's expanding a little bit. So then can we actually look at something like ace 10 6? Let's do mono Broadway. Let's look at the strategy. Does the flop strategy change a lot? No, you're mostly still betting a small bet and about 50%. Cool. When called on a queen turn, we could have chosen a 5 turn because it would have been kind of the same board. Yeah, we're still overbetting, still kind of same frequency, still kind of same range morphology. right? Okay, so you don't really need to prove this. You don't really need to go all the monoflops ace high, all the turns that are flush, and try to figure out. You only need a few data points that will kind of prove your theory, right? Just as the same in this formula right here, x to the power of n, y to the power of n, z to the power of n. Can you prove this formula? No, but you can kind of try, try to find some close numbers. Try to do n is the power of 3, right? So n is 3, right? And try to find some numbers that are like kind of close to each other and then figure out that you can't do that, right? That's kind of how we're looking at sims. You don't have to prove that on four card flush ace high boards, hijack versus big blind, or four card flush ace high boards, SRP, right? That turns an overbet and the frequency is kind of 30%. And the range morphology is mostly the same. You don't have to prove that. But if you execute that in that way, it will be an extremely well close strategy to theory, to GTO. And I think that's great, right? Because you'll be mostly inexploitable and you'll be affecting your opponent's hands that you affect with your bet size, and you just steal their equity or negate their EV, right? So make your heuristic collecting process as painless as possible. Don't dwell 7 years on the same thing trying to prove it works for all boards, right? And see if later you can bridge heuristics. And this is super important. So, okay, ace high board. Can we see a few flops like that? Ace 6 5, ace queen 7 mono. Does it work for that too? Yes, good. Does it work on a king high? Does it work on a queen high? Is that the size that we're going to take on a flush turn? Always on monotone. Might be close. So see how big the island becomes, right? Which is mostly the study method number 2, specificity to heuristic. And this is mostly what I use. It's the opposite of the first method is starting with all the boards, starting with a really specific spot and seeing how a spot works, right? You use the whole game tree, go really specific into one node and figure out the heuristics that surround that node, right? And see how much the island expands, expands, expands. How wide can you apply that heuristic, right? So, and then you see what deviations exist on the edges of that island and see what island it kind of borders, So that's kind of how you have like a whole hold the map in your head, right? So SRP monitor boards, we kind of did this more spots than ace high boards, early versus big blind or hijack versus big blind, turns and rivers, how large the island really is. But I wanted to show you guys, and I'm hoping that you can actually see this. Something that I did this month is I went into, so this is a mostly notepad, and I went into ace high boards, for example, SRP early versus big, and button versus big. And I extracted each size on the flop and frequency, and I looked at them, and I kind of drew heuristics through this, right? So from this, I took some rules, general heuristics of boards. It's like from as specific as possible. You'll see that there's every board here. I went as specific as possible. And then a lot of these heuristics, you actually just bridge them into really simplified rules. For example, so from early position, ace king low bet 75 range, ace Broadway, Broadway, B50 range, because we can find simplified nodes and simplified spots. And this is kind of everything that you need for like early position. This is the whole flop strategy that you can execute perfectly, right? There's some outliers, right? And these are like just very clear. It's like for button, it's actually like simpler. Ace Broadway, Broadway, B75, frequency 60%. And this is kind of mostly, some of them are 55, some of them are 65. You're never going to get it perfect, but the closer you are to the actual truth, the better you will become at the game. So this is part of my journey for doing this, right? So one other thing is that Owen Prodigy Missouri quote, "Who the bleep studies for bet bots lol." You be that guy. You start from there, right? What they don't study, you study, and then you put in a lot less time into 4-bet bots. Your opponents probably have something like 2 hours total. If you have 20, you'll have like absolute massive edge. Doesn't have to be perfect. Just actually start somewhere. Find heuristics from specifics and see how wide they extend, right? Realize your opponents are human and try to figure out where counters are hard to execute and find. And based on that, simplify your strategy. And for this, I would also like I've saved one more spot that I want to show you guys. This is a 4-bet pot. So let's say that we open hijack. Small blind has 3-bet, hijack has 4-bet, and small blind has called. And I wanted to show you that, for example, hijack will bet 10% on this flop. So we'll really choose the 10% size. I'll try to use range height. So this is, sorry, full height. So this is illustrated a little bit better. And I will use AI solve. Sorry, I didn't. Yeah, I'll use the AI solve for this one. Yeah, let's just do the ace queen. And let's try the 10% size. I didn't add it to the solve, but I think it's gonna be quite interesting. So if you look at the ranges, the EV will be something like 27.74. What are we accomplishing? Number one, what you should be looking at is what are we accomplishing with this bet size? Why are we betting 10% of the pot? And the truth is that you can always go to the summary tab in your opponent's range and look like what exactly are we doing with this 10%? Ace queen? Okay. We're looking at getting him to mix pocket nines, king jack. So the gut shot should actually fold in this spot. And you never expect this. Your opponents will probably pure call this. All the pocket pairs that are below are really super suffering, like pocket jacks, pocket tens, just pure folding against a 10% bet size. So you always kind of look at this. So now, what if we were to just range bet this? 2774, we're looking at REV, 2754, right? So you might think, oh, we're we're gonna lose that much EV. Part of it is actually fake, but this is not really gonna happen. Your opponent is not going to magically raise 27% for about almost half his range. So he's not gonna start raising pocket sevens, pocket sixes, pocket fives, pocket fours. We can look at the normalized height now. Raise all these pairs, start raising king jack instead of just pure calling or actually folding it. Raise all the aces like 8 ton. This is never gonna happen. So you will always regain in this simplify mode when looking at the root node and looking at your EV, you will never lose as much as a clairvoyant solver will just absolutely break you into, right? They're not going to raise something like 35%. So you can kind of look at these like high pairs and 4-bet pots and try to figure out, is bet 10 better or like is bet 25? Can I actually range bet 10, right? Look at the counter. Is it humanly executable? Ask yourself, is somebody actually going to know and not absolutely dump these instantly, like absolutely not dump like all these pocket pairs. Is somebody going to start raising pocket sixes, no heart on this board? Probably not. you know, you're probably safe. Start calling jacks instead of, well, jacks I think is kind of pure calling. But anyways, you can model your opponent's strategy. You'll completely reduce his raising range to something like if you're in a 3-bet pot, sorry, 4-bet pot, you see ace queen, you have pocket sixes, your opponent bets into you, and you know his range is like absolutely strong. You're not gonna start raising in general. You're mostly gonna start like kind of in a way, in a sense, overfolding. So your EV might just jump back up even higher than it kind of used to be before. Anyways, I think that's kind of what I wanted to convey in today's coaching. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for attending. Get a I don't know what to say to end it. Get a better score than this. I don't know. On your 25 flop subset. I'm just kidding. This is decent. Okay. And yeah, super super appreciate you guys. I'm very happy to do my first coaching here, and hopefully I'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you so much for attending. And I hope you guys will actually open a sim tonight. Have a great time. Cheers.